Good morning, everyone. Look, I'm just rapt already to be here, but before I start, it's really important for me to acknowledge that this conference is being held on Aboriginal land. I recognise the strength, resilience and capacity of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional custodians of this place that we call Sydney. I pay my greatest respect to their elders, to my elders, and to all our elders, past, present, and to the many generations yet to come. As you heard, a little bit about my bio. I'm really fortunate as a lawyer to be working so closely in this health space. I have learnt in my very small time in working with Aboriginal community-controlled health how advocacy should look and how partnerships should be working together in order to reach real impact for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. It's really important for me to thank deeply the KNS board for being so generous and kind in inviting me here today to speak to all of you. It's really a special pleasure for me to be among so many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander brothers and sisters. Without all of you in the room, the health gap would be so much wider. Without you, there would be little cultural safety in our hospitals and medical services. I've seen how important your work is on the ground at Woodchopperan and across many other sites that I've been fortunate enough to visit. You guys are the absolute backbone of Aboriginal health. So I plan to speak for 25 minutes, and thank you all, because I hear that you all had a great night last night, so I'll try and make it lively. And then I want to leave 20 minutes at the end, because I want to invite questions from the floor. I want to hear your ideas on how we can cooperate across the sector to develop a better workforce with cultural safety embedded throughout the hundreds of clinics and hospitals across this great country. Oh, there we go. I was really impressed by the theme you chose for your conference, connecting care through culture. That simple phrase truly captures so much of what we do in our sector each and every day. Cultural safety, I believe, is what makes us extremely unique and what represents our greatest strength. In the Aboriginal community-controlled health organisations, the ACCHOs or ARCHOs, depending on what jurisdiction you come from, you have this reinforced daily through the operating model. Community control is not just a term. It is a 48-year-old model forged at Redfern in 1971, and it is now exercised in 144 local Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities across the country. Our people trust us with their health. We build ongoing relationships to give continuity of care so that chronic conditions are managed and preventative health care is effectively targeted. Studies have shown that Aboriginal controlled health services are 23% better at attracting and retaining Aboriginal clients than mainstream providers. Through local engagement and a proven service delivery model, our clients stick. The cultural safety in which we provide our services is a key factor of our success. In this way, ARCHOs are already leading the way. We also build partnerships that make things work. Leadership is not all about the strength to stand up on your own. It is about being smart enough to stand shoulder to shoulder with one another. It is about galvanising support on the ground. It is about forging alliances in the sector and building strategic partnerships at the national level. Another strength, and we have many of them, one that we really tend to overlook, is the sheer size of our sector. Let's have a look at ACCHOs, just ACCHOs alone. It is not widely known, but the 144 ACCHOs collectively are the single largest employer of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia. That means that 1 in every 44 Indigenous jobs in Australia is at one of our health services. If we add the Aboriginal health workers in the mainstream and the rest of the sector, these numbers become all the more impressive. Our sector is doing more to close the gap in employment than anything that the government has dreamed up in their wisdom over the years. If the government really wants people to get off welfare, don't punish vulnerable people with cashless welfare debt cards, robo-debts, or by sending them off to bloody meaningless work for the dole activities. Work with our sector and grow the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander workforce. And let's do that together, government. We have real jobs located in real communities. This is where all of the investment needs to go. We should remind our politicians of this every opportunity that we get. If they visit your communities, remind them of this. They may see a small clinic somewhere with a few staff, but if they truly understood that we are part of a huge national network of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander professionals, they might take more notice of us and realise that what we have to offer is real impact. Another challenge for us is continuing the development of a comprehensive primary healthcare model. I think we've been hearing this since the release of the National Aboriginal Health Strategy back in 1989. 21 years later, a study concluded that ACCHOs are one of the very few settings where comprehensive primary health care is actually delivered. If we keep offering a comprehensive approach for primary health care across the nation, our people will be much less likely to fall between the cracks. We can do this through co-location of services or forming partnerships at the local level. This can include clinical care, immunisation and environmental health programs, on-site pharmaceutical dispensers and partnerships with family violence, child protection counselling and my favourite, legal services. We can also develop links with sports programs, homelessness services, dental services, aged care and disability support. None of these elements can fully succeed if they stand alone. The voluminous literature on the social determinants of health tell us that. But more importantly, it is what we all know from our own personal lived experiences. You don't need an academic to tell any of you that comprehensive primary health care is the one and only approach. It's the best. We all know this intuitively and from our experiences on the ground. I'm not saying that we should all diversify or dilute what we are doing. What I'm saying is that while we focus on our core activities, we should also be taking every opportunity to link up with other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander services and programs that would complement your area of expertise. From my own experience at Woodchopper Health Service based in Cairns, I run a legal clinic. Health justice partnerships, I'm beyond passionate about. What we know about our people is that they are more likely to come into contact with the criminal justice system. Our children are more likely to be removed from community and kin. Our youth are more likely to spend some time in a detention centre. So for me, we needed to do things different in my community. We needed to embed legal rights. My people needed to know what their rights are in order to be informed and in order to make decisions based on real information. When you think about it, it should not be very hard to promote ourselves, to sell ourselves to a new government. After all, we provide extreme value for money. ACCHOs result in greater health benefits per dollar spent, measured at a value of $1.19 for each dollar. Studies have shown that the lifetime health impact of interventions delivered by ACCHOs is 50% greater than if these same interventions were delivered by mainstream health services. This is primarily due to improved Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander access and outcomes. I don't need to tell you that we also have some pretty significant challenges ahead of us, and I'd like to address a few of them now, one by one. Remuneration. If we're serious about workforce development, then we cannot ignore the issue of wages. Correct me if I'm wrong, but from what I've heard, remuneration is a big issue for nurses and midwives. The Australian Labor Party, as part of its election platform in May of this year, had much to say about improving wages and conditions in the childcare sector, and, justifiably that should be so. Childcare is another industry in which women dominate but are underpaid. We need the Commonwealth and state governments to take a similar approach to nurses and midwives. As you all know, women make up almost 90% of all employed nurses and midwives. Representative bodies like NACCHO and KNS need to work together to drive this message home to governments across the country. Remuneration is an important aspect in retaining and attracting staff. Vocational development. I think we need to keep improving the career development opportunities and skills acquisition, not just for nurses and midwives, but for all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health workers. Currently, there is an imbalance in the medical services in which we see more Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people on the lower levels and amongst the non-clinical staff. The graph in my presentation shows the situation for ACCHOs. We need more Aboriginal non-clinical staff, but we also need even more Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander clinical staff. Recruitment. I see that KNS has an extremely proud record in increasing its membership in recent years. I think you've had a record number in your 2018 annual report, 1,366 members, representing a jump of 35%. Clearly, you are doing something right to have recruited so many new members. You must have won the trust and loyalty of your members to have such a healthy and expanding membership base. With almost half of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nurses and midwives in Australia as your members, KNS is a key organisation in addressing many of the workforce development issues in our sector. Certainly, much more needs to be done to develop career pathways to secure more Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nurses and midwives, as well as more doctors and allied health professionals. Across Australia in 2015, AIHW reported that there were only about 180 medical practitioners, 750 allied health professionals, and 3,200, including 230 midwives, who identified as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people. For nurses, this represents just 1% of all employed nurses and midwives Australia-wide. The Northern Territory, 2.4%, Tasmania, 2.2%, had the highest proportion of Aboriginal nurses and midwives, while Victoria, 0.5%. Compare these figures to our proportion of working age Australians, close to 3%. We would have 3% of all nurses and midwives. This is what we need to aim towards, not sitting at the 1%. We have to find ways to build those pathways, because when our people are in the driving seat, serving our communities, we all know the impact is far greater. As I've already said, our sector is the largest employer of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people across the country. Now, if the ACHOs as a group employ about 6,000 staff, I'm really proud of that, let me say that again, 6,000 staff, of 56% that identify as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders, then we still have another 2,500 jobs in our sector which could be filled by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. We have a significant opportunity here. Think of what we could do for our people if we filled such a large number of jobs, what that would look like in our communities. Retention. A big challenge that we confront every day, particularly in the bush and our remote communities, is retention. Stress and burnout is a real problem. Turnover of staff is high and vacancies remain unfilled for very long periods of time. With so many vacancies, particularly in remote clinics, a concerted effort could also have a significant positive impact on the size and health of our workforce. It is troubling to hear of the high reported vacancy rate of 6%. That's around 380 vacancies that we have at this moment. Nevertheless, ACHOs are doing pretty well in comparison with mainstream and non-Aboriginal organisations. The proportion of health vacancies was 6% compared to 9% for other organisations. My guess is that the reason why we're at 6 and non-Indigenous are at 9 is because of the cultural safety we offer. So if we have a good model and we have a sector already working above and beyond for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health, then how are we truly going? If we look at just one of the closing the gap targets, life expectancy, you can see how stark the differences are. According to ABS data, which probably overestimates Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander life expectancy, non-Aboriginal Australians can expect to live to about the age of 82. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are lucky to make it to 72. We all can do maths here, 10-year difference. We would be better off living in other countries where the life expectancy is higher. Countries, believe it or not, like Bangladesh. Life expectancy is longer in some third world countries than it is for our people here on their lands. Despite all the words we've heard from Commonwealth and state governments over the years about closing the gap, instead of increasing expenditure, governments have actually decreased expenditure on Aboriginal health over the past decade. Governments need to spend 2 to 3 times more on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health if we are to have a level of funding commensurate with the actual cost of the burden of disease. This is a huge sum, and one estimate I want to throw out to the room, it's going to take about 1.4 billion. In real terms, health expenditure, excluding hospital expenditure, for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people fell by 2% from 2008 to 2016. Over that same period, expenditure on non-Aboriginal people rose by 10%. We decreased by 2, non-Indigenous increased by 10%. How can you expect to close the gap when you are reducing funding for our people and increasing it for the non-Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population? If we act as one, we can turn things around. Look at the way that the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peaks, like Nacho and Katsinem, stood together to force the 9 Australian, and let me stress, force the 9 Australian governments to restart the Closing the Gap process. Before we came together and complained to government, the consultation process was bullshit. It was expensive lip service. I apologise for saying that. But we stood together with one voice. Our separate voices as individual orgs were ignored. Government is now listening. Now things are back on track. Funds are tighter than ever to procure, but over the years we've built a world-class model of healthcare, and there is too much at stake for us now to start drifting backwards again. The time is critical, especially now that we have a re-elected government and the new arrangements in the administration of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander programs. It is great to see Ken White as the first Aboriginal Cabinet member as the Minister for Indigenous Australians. But we need to engage as closely as we can, not only with Minister White, but also with Minister Hunt. We also need to keep the dialogue open with Senator Dodson, Senator McCarthy, and the member for Barton in New South Wales, Linda Burney. There are also plenty of good Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leaders in the state and territory governments, and I urge you again to keep talking to them. It is important to have our voice heard, especially when we face a mainstream system that continues to overlook us, especially when we have a mainstream system that continues to patronise us. If we don't act now and keep the pressure up, we will lose some of our recent hard-won gains. Oh, I'm a slide behind. Sorry, guys. The future. Despite the appalling funding neglect for programs and the low wages paid to our health workers, you have all shone in adversity. You are resilient. You survive despite whatever circumstances you find yourselves in. It's self-determination and the need to control our health and our health programs that led to the ACHO model. It is a lesson for our sector. If the system was working now, we would have 0 preventable hospital admissions. The evidence is not just here, it is overseas as well. In Canada, it has been shown that First Nations communities that transitioned out of government control to community-controlled health have experienced 30% hospital reduction compared with communities where government control was maintained. In a perfect world, our model of primary care through community-controlled would also be complete. We would have full coverage across the land. We would also have an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander NDIS workforce in fully funded models for disability services rollout Australia-wide. And of course, all this hinges on a more accountable public health system and an uncapped needs-based funding model. Truly, who knows what it could look like if we had all these things? We may even seriously imagine a future in which we have actually closed the gap in health. With Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander hands, I know that we can get there eventually. Nacho and Katsinam continue to work together and to set the way forward for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health. But we can also show the non-Indigenous population what is possible. It is this future that I imagine for myself, for my daughter, and for my own family. And I'm sure that that is a vision that we all share. Leading the way for all of Australia through community control, cultural safety, and deep respect. Thank you all once again for inviting me here. I hope that you all continue to enjoy what sounds like has been a brilliant conference, and I just want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. Thank you.
Hello? Yep. Thank you for your presentation. It was really good. A lot of what you were presenting is actually some of the work that I've done in my PhD. What my question is to you, I noticed that you said that you had 380 vacancies currently in your NACCHO institutions across Australia. Is there an opportunity, or do you do it, for our newly graduated nurses, registered nurses, to fill those gaps? And the reason why I say this is because as the universities are graduating more registered nurses than we have positions in transition to practice programs. So is there an opportunity for some of our people to come and work with you as newly graduated nurses? Do you have a transition to practice program?
I'm looking at you, Mel. Is that something that we...
Thank you. Look, it's a really good question, and I think this is a really great conversation. Thanks, Donella. I think there is opportunities there. I just don't think we've created those pathways myself. Yeah. So. Yes, exactly.
Yeah. And if I could respond as well, and thank you for the question, that's one example of how this dialogue between NACCHO and Katsinam, we need to keep that conversation about what your expertise and your needs of students and graduates, how we can facilitate that transition, because we want what you guys have.
And following on from, I think it was Michelle Deschong's presentation yesterday, about our own governance and our own leadership, we need to demonstrate to the government that we don't necessarily need them to help us and along the way. And I shudder when I hear people say real jobs. There's a lot of people, Aboriginal people, that work in a variety of positions in mainstream, and we need to change that negative discourse on Aboriginal people having not real jobs. We need to move away from that, because we participate in mainstream, so we just need to change that dialogue.
And finally, can I invite you to also put that forward? We're doing the consultation currently around closing the gap, around those sort of key issues and challenges that people are facing in the community. Please put that forward so that can all be collated.
That's great. Thanks, Donella. I think that was a wonderful presentation. It's like you and I talked and we didn't even talk, because it's leading on to some stuff we're going to talk about today, particularly around pathways and stuff, but also some of the closing gap stuff I'm going to talk about as well. My question to you is around justice and education and all the other government agencies that work with our people. So there's a little community out of Derby called Mowanjum, and one of the elders said to some government representatives, we have up to 80 agencies coming into our little community of 200 people, knocking on our doors, and we're sick of it. And he said, why can't you mob talk to each other and coordinate it? So now we don't open the doors anymore. So how do we as peaks, NACCHO and ourselves, work together with other government agencies to say, we know what our people need, we know how services need to work, but how do we work together? Because our people are moving in and out of every single system, and it's not coordinated and it's not a good process. So I know it's a curly one, but putting it out there.
No, that's a great question. A couple of things. With my lawyer's hat, we need structural reform. And what structural reform looks like is changing the way that delivery operates. So we all know that Commissioner Romilly Mockach is doing the unpacking around money spent that's going into our communities. Recently in Queensland, they've released the Productivity Commission on money that is being dispersed into Indigenous communities, discrete and regional. And what they identified in Queensland was for each blackfella in a regional and discrete community, $29,000 was allocated by government. But that $29,000 was dispersed over more than 30 organisations that would fly in and fly out. So the bigger issue behind that is Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have become a business model. We've become this government business model where non-Indigenous people, non-Indigenous organisations are tapping into specific funds. So for me, it really is that structural reform. Our people are so bloody tired of having to go to so many different agencies, share their personal story and be disrespected, come into contact with institutional, racism, and then still not get a bloody outcome. So, yeah, Mel, it's something that we're working on, but government needs to stop giving funds in silo, and they need to see us as the preferred supplier. Not churches, not other NGOs. Yeah.
Donella, sorry, I haven't been here for most of it, but it's no new news, over the years. My question is, we have Minister Wyatt, and how is he helping us in this? Did you talk about that initially? And how could he be a good advocate for Katzenam and NACCHO in those issues that you were talking about?
I'm thinking deeply about how to respond to that. Minister White has an extreme responsibility in front of him. So I also want to pay respect that, he's one black man. And we're going to work with him, believe me, but he is not going to have all the levers for us. It's about working across government. It's about, Minister Hunt and the Prime Minister have really worked with us. And I'm saying that with all respect to Minister White. We have achieved a great deal from working with the Prime Minister and Minister Hunt. So, Minister White, I'm so thrilled that we have our first Aboriginal man sitting in Cabinet, but I don't want us to be under an illusion that he is going to be the panacea that's going to bring us social justice. We need to be across everybody.
Hi. I often get asked in my job a lot, especially by our directors of mission and our directors who are trying to maintain employment in healthcare and hospital facilities. One of the issues that we're finding is we don't really have an issue with recruiting, we don't really have an issue with recruiting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but we actually have an issue maintaining them a lot of the time because our mob and our people getting university degrees and things like that is actually quite a new concept. So a lot of the time our Aboriginal nurses are coming in as graduates and then they're being pulled in all these different directions to go to VATCHOs and NATCHOs and a lot of the time to become policy makers. I tend to think that that's a really good thing, but a lot of the time our hospitals don't push back, but they are trying to retain our nurses. Do you sort of have any advice to healthcare facilities when they're finding that they're having issues with actually maintaining their Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander workforce?
Retention is an enormous challenge, and there's a number of factors why retention is a challenge. Reconciliation action plans in and of itself. You know, a lot of organisations are looking at Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander staff. So again, we've become this wonderful model of people want us, but there's a challenge in that. Moving out of a space where you're identifying who you are day in and day out, moving into a space where you become the token Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander worker, and the pay packet may be high. You know, we all want to have successful careers. I certainly want to have a successful career, and I've had to learn through a lot of pain what success looks like, and it's not necessarily monetary success, but retention, absolutely. NACHO as a clear example, we struggle in employing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander staff because they can earn so much more in the public sector. So remuneration is something that is a live challenge, and we just have to keep working through it. We occupy less than 3% of the population. You young ones that are coming through that are just going to make my retirement so sweet, you're wanted. The top 400 corporations, they all have reconciliation action plans. They're wanting to employ Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So that takes our people out of our communities. So it is a huge challenge.
Hello? Yep. Hi, Donella. I'm just interested in what you were saying about the recruitment and retention, and particularly in the remuneration. There's a huge disparity in wages which are advertised between mainstream and Aboriginal positions, and I constantly encourage our mob to just apply for the mainstream position. But having said that, we've had huge amounts of really good, motivated Aboriginal positions, and I'm just thinking of Ange. Ange is sitting in here somewhere, with a position at Murrumbidgee Health, specifically to support Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nurses and midwives in that region. And without reason or explanation, that position just gets pulled, thrown away. And that happens to be a constant in Aboriginal positions in mainstream space. They get funded, they're very short term, they expect miracles, and they turn them around and throw them out before there's an opportunity to even do a proper evaluation. I guess my question out of that is, when we're talking about the peak bodies sticking together, there's the Achos, there's Katsanam, there's Aida, there's Natsiwa. There's a whole group of health people who all should be standing together at Minister Hunt's door and the Prime Minister's door and saying, you know, like, if these positions are created, they have to be created with a lifespan of at least 10 years. Is there any opportunity for you to work with that?
That challenge we have been working with for the past 48 years. So for NACHO, a lot of our funding to our member services is 1 year, 18 months, 3 years. We have had to work so hard advocating with government for 5-year contracts. Now, achieving that is enormous because, as you said, funding, it's a wheel. Government, they're also a wheel. They're in one day, they're out. If we're not the flavour of their priority, the money's not coming to us. And so it's bodies like KNS, NACHO, AIDA, IHA, all of us, the Coalition of Peaks. It'll be a part of the way that we work in closing the gap with COAG and through our Coalition of Peaks about making sure that there is sustainability, because changing the burden of disease, of which our people are 2.3 times higher than non-Indigenous, we're not going to be able to do anything if it's a 2-year funding term. So exactly as you said, we're dependent on government for funds, but what we are saying to them is we need a longer term, but we need you to make sure that our smaller services, that you also give them a longer term. It needs to be grandfathered. I think my time's up, is it? Oh,
Good, thanks. Good day, sorry. I work in an Aboriginal health service in Perth. One of the things I've experienced is that our organisation had to have a fight for survival and relevance. What does NACHO do in supporting Aboriginal health or medical services with their governance? One of the things I've experienced is that there's a pull in different directions. Do we go with a business model, trying to attract the Medicare claims where registered nurses don't do that, so we become irrelevant? The other one is the Egalitarian Model. People come to us with social needs, welfare. They say, NACHO says, come to Aboriginal health services. People say, well, do I choose between taking my medications or paying the bill? I can't pay the bill. Go and see the welfare officer. Every month we say there's no food vouchers, no assistance with the electricity bills, nothing like that. So they have to make a decision to spend their medication money on paying off the bill, and they do. And the other one is the clinical care model. Do we keep people in chronic disease? Because if we manage chronic disease, we still attract that Medicare claims, and that keeps our service door open. But one of the things I've done is, when I came into nursing, I wanted to make a real change. It does lead to burnout and frustration to see that there is no real significant change in the communities in regards to chronic disease. And I do all this work with the community, but a lot of the people do die. That's what I see. And there's no, we just bring them in, turn them through the system, and the chronic disease is still there. But that also removes the direction away from those other important aspects. We're too much focused on chronic disease, but what about youth suicide?
there was a lot in that. Social determinants of health. Holistic model of care. Looking at the social, spiritual, cultural. That is our model. Governance is absolutely a challenge. I don't want to speak on behalf of any of the member services. In order to have thriving communities, our boards have to take a real long lens and a strategic vision about how to bring those things forward into our community. Medicare, my personal view on Medicare is that is an uncapped bank over here. We absolutely need to have appropriate needs-based funding based on the burden of disease But I want us to be able to tap into everything, and that is ultimately up to communities. Now, you heard me speak about partnering. Partnering is really key because government operate in silos. We are funded in silos. So when it comes to live, real issues around, am I going to feed myself or am I going to get my diabetes medication? No, well, I'm going to feed myself. Back home in Cairns, what we've done is, because our people come to us and tell us, and they hold us bloody accountable, as you know, we've partnered with other NGOs to be able to have food options. We've partnered with centre cares, with any church organisation where we can say, you know what, let's enter into an MOU because we know you have brokerage, we know you have resources, we know that our clients are coming to see you. They're all shared clients, but we have to find some way of integrating because our people don't just need their health issues addressed, they need their justice issues addressed, they've got tenancy issues, they've got debt, coming into contact with the child protection system. So there's a whole raft of things that need to happen. I hope that government's never going to fund us to do everything, but we certainly can take control by determining what partners on our terms that we want to engage with in order to best represent our families. Thank you.